Hello and welcome to the video on primary and secondary resources for executive communication. My name is Dr. Michael Edmondson. So for this project, generally speaking for any project, there are two types of sources that people use. There are primary sources and there are secondary sources. And this video is going to take a look at explaining both primary and secondary sources, and it's going to provide a series of examples for each as well. So let's take a look at primary sources. Primary sources provide direct or first-hand evidence about an event, object, person, or work of art. Generally speaking, it's about someone that witnessed or participated in an event. For example, if someone was at an inauguration of a president, they could speak about the first-hand account of being there. The president could speak because he was actively involved in it. Anybody witnessing the event from the stands could also be a primary source. So primary source is someone that's witnessed or was the participant in an event. That's very important to understand. That's a critical difference between primary and secondary sources. Published materials of primary participants can be viewed as primary sources if they come from the time period that is being discussed and were written or produced by someone with first-hand experience of the event. So let's say you were at a concert, let's say the Woodstock concert, and you were there, or if you were a band member and you wrote about it, then that would be a primary source. So it's very important to understand that a published material that is written by someone who witnessed the account firsthand or was part of the event is a primary source. Primary sources also provide the original materials on which other research is based and enable researchers to get as close as possible to what actually happened during a particular event or time period. So if you wanted to study the political impact of the, let's say, American Revolution, well, that was hundreds of years ago, so you are not a primary source, but you can go and find primary records of people that were involved in the American Revolution and then write about it. Primary sources also reflect the viewpoint of a participant or observer. This is very important to understand when you're writing history, because if you are writing about a controversial event or major historical event like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you have a variety of viewpoints to consider. The Americans that were at the Pearl Harbor base, those that witnessed it from afar, and then you also have the Japanese viewpoint. So you have multiple viewpoints. And when you're considering primary sources, you also must take into consideration the viewpoint. In scientific research, primary sources present original thinking. They report on their scientific discoveries, and they often share new information. And finally, primary sources can be written or non-written, video, sound, pictures, artifacts. So it's important to remember that a primary resource doesn't have to be written. There are other formats in which a primary source can be delivered. So let's take a look at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 examples of primary sources. First, autobiographies and memoirs. And this happens all the time with presidents. They write their memoirs, and it's a good way to let the country know what happened from their viewpoint. So that is very common. Recordings, right? There are video recordings, audio recordings. Oh, that's another primary source. Original documents, government offices, businesses, they all produce documents. So if it's an original document, that is a primary source. Email correspondence. The nice thing about email is it has a date and time stamp, and you can tell who it's from and where it went to or who it went to, and that is a primary source. Organizational records. So any organization generally needs to keep records for a certain period of time. Those records are primary sources. Diaries and personal letters. And in today's nomenclature, we would consider text messages, Snapchat messages, Facebook messages. They're all electronic forms of personal letters from one person to another. Government publications are considered primary sources for the specific time. So if you're doing research on the 1920s, you obviously don't use a Department of Commerce report from the 1980s. You go back to the 1920s and find a Department of Commerce report. Interviews and surveys, another form of primary sources. Speeches, lots of people conduct speeches, and now a lot of them are recorded online. So that is certainly a primary source. And then books published at the time of the event are generally considered primary sources. So there's a lot of different options there. Autobiographies and memoirs, diaries and personal letters, books published at the time, interviews and surveys, original documents, recordings, government publications, organizational records, speeches, and email correspondence are all considered primary sources. Now let's take a look at secondary sources. So secondary sources are very different from primary sources. Secondary sources describe, discuss, interpret, comment upon, analyze, evaluate, summarize, and process primary sources. So you can't have secondary sources unless you have primary sources, because secondary sources use primary sources for their analysis. Secondary sources generally one or more steps removed from the event or time period and are written or produced after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. It's important to remember that this is someone that did not witness the event, may not have even been alive during the event. I think if you wanted to write a book about, the building of the Egyptian pyramids, well, it's the 21st century. You certainly weren't alive back then, so you're going to use primary sources to write a secondary report about the building of the pyramids. Secondary sources often lack the freshness and immediacy of the original material. There's just no way around that. It is not an original account, so it is going to lack some freshness. Authors of secondary sources most likely never witnessed the event directly. That's very true. They just are reporting on it after the fact. On occasion, secondary sources will collect, organize, and repackage primary source information to increase usability and speed of delivery, such as an online encyclopedia or a reference book. That's just par for the course with secondary sources. And like primary sources, secondary materials can be written or non-written. They can be in video, sound, pictures, movies, and some other ways as well. So let's take a look at some examples of secondary sources. We'll take a look at 10 here. Biographies. I might write a book about Herbert Hoover. That is a biography. If Herbert Hoover wrote a book about himself, that would be an autobiography, right? Documentaries. Magazine articles after the event. Editorials. Editorials are pieces published generally in newspapers about a specific situation, and they generally have a very strong viewpoint. Interpretations of an event. So you might have published an article or book looking at 2 or 3 viewpoints of a specific event. Books published after the event. Many historical books are published about events that happened centuries ago. They're secondary sources. Textbooks are all secondary sources. Now again, these secondary sources are probably going to use primary sources. That's where they get their information from. Reference books are very good collections of primary sources. Interviews with family members. So if you had someone that was, if you had a great-great-great-grandparent perhaps, that was alive in 1900, and your grandfather or great-great-grandfather interviewed them and took those notes down, then that would be an interview with a family member that witnessed life in 1900, because your family member did not witness life in 1900. And finally, book reviews are also secondary sources. So let's take a look at 2 examples here. We have Becoming by Michelle Obama, and an opinion piece by the historian Eric Foner that was published December 31st, 2012 in the New York Times, called The Emancipation of Abe Lincoln. Now, based on what we just said about primary and secondary sources, which is primary, which is second here? So let's just uncover them at the same time. So Michelle Obama is primary, and Eric Foner's editorial is secondary. Let's take a look why. Obama's book provides direct or first-hand evidence about an event, person, or person, and obviously the time that she served as First Lady, is direct first-hand account. So that's a primary source. Eric Foner's editorial, The Emancipation of Abe Lincoln, is a secondary one because he's describing, discussing, interpreting, commenting upon, analyzing, evaluating, summarizing, and processing Abe Lincoln, and Foner did not live during Lincoln's time. So that's our summary for the differences between primary and secondary sources. And if you have any questions, please remember to reach out to me. Thank you, and good luck with your primary and secondary resources.